You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
If you think about your history class, sometimes for a lot of people, it was a class that they probably dreaded. But think about this as that history class. I want to give people that opportunity to see history in that capsulated way through my eyes, to know it should be something that should be remembered and learned from.
Hello, and welcome to episode 386 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Today we have a special treat. In honor of Juneteenth, my Innovation Studios colleague Ashley Bachnight is going to lead us on an exploration of the Slave Dwelling Project. The Slave Dwelling Project seeks to raise awareness about the existence of and the need to preserve slave dwellings and other structures that are significant to both the enslaved ancestors and to our complete understanding of early American and United States history. Now, Ashley is a historian who specializes in public history. She works in the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios as a digital content producer. Throughout her career, she has worked as a community leader and consultant for various museums, historic sites, and neighborhood history projects in the United States Southeast. And among her research specialties is community outreach and the inclusivity of museums. Now, I think we're really going to enjoy this conversation. In previous episodes, we've explored different aspects of slavery and enslaved life within the United States. But in this episode, Ashley will help us explore why the preservation and memory of the buildings where enslaved people once lived is equally as important as preserving other historic sites and spaces that add to our knowledge of United States history. And with that, here's Ashley Bachnight and our latest historical exploration.
In this special Juneteenth episode, as we honor the emancipation of enslaved African Americans, we will delve into the work of those working to preserve slave dwellings across the United States, safeguarding the essential stories these structures embody. In our conversation, our guests will share why former slave dwellings are vital to our nation's history and what they reveal about the lives of those who once lived them. As we explore these important pieces of the past, consider, why is it important to preserve these humble yet powerful symbols of history? What stories do they hold that we risk losing if they're forgotten? And how can we understand this part of our heritage? And how can understanding this part of our heritage shape a more inclusive and truthful reflection of our nation's past? Joseph McGill, author, executive director, and founder of the Slave Dwelling Project, joins us to discuss the importance of historic preservation and why preserving former slave dwellings are vital to our nation's history. Using details from his book, Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery, Joe reveals how to use documents and artifacts to preserve historic structures, the importance of living history programs at historic sites, and how public memory impacts the preservation of colonial-era structures. Okay, are you ready to explore the world of historic preservation and see how preservation is worked to save significant historic structures? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us today is public historian, scholar, executive director, and founder of the Slave Dwelling Project. He has previously served as a park ranger for the National Park Service, as well as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. He is the author of Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Joseph McGill.
Thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Joe, we know slavery is an integral part of the American history story, yet living conditions and experiences of the enslaved people are often overlooked. Against this backdrop, the Slave Dwelling Project seems to shed light on a neglected aspect of our nation's past. Would you share what a slave dwelling actually is and what inspired you to the project?
The dwelling is those places where our enslaved ancestors inhabited while they were having their services done at this place of enslavement. So those dwellings are those places where they actually physically stayed, which in a lot of cases are there, have been there since they were built there. In some places where these places are no more, we still want to know these entities to know that once upon a time in their narrative, in their history, they should be telling that or disseminating that information amongst all the other information that they disseminate about that place. So the opportunity to do that lies in these dwellings. So the Slave Dwelling Project is that effort to bring attention to these spaces that have already been there or should be represented at these places. We shed light and we praise the ones that do and we name the ones that don't. So we just leave it there.
Based on your research, why is there such a wide variety of slave dwellings?
Depends on when the land was developed, when it was colonized, and by which European country was in that physical space, applying their ways of doing things. If you're on the coast, which many states that prospered during that period, they started on the coast of that particular state where the docks were, where the labor was being brought in. And they were building these buildings in accordance with what was there at that place. You know, you get these variations of these buildings existing in places. And a lot of times, sometimes they're in northern states, which tends to garner pushback when you interpret that aspect of slave dwellings because there's a misconception that it was a southern thing, and it was, but it was not a northern thing, and it was. So we convince the public that that's an element of the story also.
To date, you've conducted over 250 overnights at approximately 150 sites in 25 states and Washington, D.C. That is outstanding. Now, in your book, Sleeping with the Ancestors, you state that the original name of the project was the Slave Cabin Project. Why was it important for you to change the name of the project to the Slave Dwelling Project after already establishing quite a bit of notoriety under the name the Slave Cabin Project?
It's about the space. It's about that very space. In my mind, when I graduated, a slave cabin to me was that a cabin. It was also on a southern plantation. So my understanding of slavery was limited to what I was taught, that right there. Then I started the project just based on that thought. But then I went to Alabama, and the place I was going to stay was 2 levels, and it was brick. That was not a cabin by my definition of what cabins were. To me, that was a dwelling. So that was very early on in the process, and I'm glad it happened very early on in the process. So I changed the name from cabin to dwelling because it's more encompassing. Because in this title as dwellings, you can also easily transfer that to these places in the North where slavery was sometimes much more intimate. You had more people enslaving people, but they were enslaving less people. These people are sometimes on the property that they're on from birth to death in close proximity. So sometimes these enslaved people are living in the attics, or sometimes they're living in the basements. Sometimes these places are saved by default, just based on the fact that they want to save the parts that apply to their ancestors. You know, those are dwellings also where our enslaved ancestors once inhabited. It's all encompassing.
In Sleeping with the Ancestors, you discuss the impact of your military service on your career trajectory into history. Would you share with us how your tenure in the Air Force led you to your current history preservation work?
I'm from a small town of King Street, South Carolina, and the population there is probably about 5,000 for the whole county. And in the third or fourth grade, maybe fifth, the schools were integrated. And to young kids, that's a good thing. You know, you just get to be kids. Just because you're kids, you do kids things, you think kid things. And what you see in front of you is a person, until you grow up and then you become more biased in your thinking. But being from a small town, you kind of stay with those biases that you have and sometimes don't know you have. And then you're released into a world where you have to survive. So my version of that was graduating from high school in maybe May of 1979. And 2 weeks later, I'm in the Air Force. So I'm in San Antonio, Texas, and I'm being amongst all the others. I was rare. There were other blacks with me, but their numbers were far less than there were whites. So, that's the world I had to live in for 6 years and adjust. But what that taught me is not to be afraid of the unknown. And even more so than that was you have to give individuals opportunities, and you shouldn't judge others of that same likeness of this other individual. You should not judge them as a group. You should judge them all individually. Now, they may prove to you that they're not of your liking, but give them that chance to prove that. You may find that otherwise. So I'm not afraid of the unknown. So the Air Force kind of thrust me into survival in their entity to do the 6 years that I did and get the opportunities to travel to places that I traveled. And one place in particular that is very vital to this story is I got to go into the place where Anne Frank hid from the Germans. And in that space, it planted a seed that would lie dormant about spaces and the need to preserve these spaces. Although the history of these places are not always positive, having the place there gives you the opportunity to go into that place and feel whatever you want to feel. But if the place is not there, the opportunity lies to continue to deny the existence of that place and therefore the existence of the people who inhabited those spaces. So it's very important that we save the places because we can.
Slave dwellings come in many forms, as you've shared, from grand plantation houses to humble cabins. Each dwelling tells a unique story about the lives of enslaved people and the system of slavery that shaped America. How do you choose which slave dwellings to visit and spend the night in?
Well, the thing about the big house is when I started 14 years ago, I would go to these sites, and first thing the site manager of the place would want to show me is the big house. And I resisted. And I think my resistance showed to them. But here's how I have changed my way of thinking about that. In those big houses, we can interpret things that I'm sure some of the current interpreters fail to do. We can interpret that nice grand staircase when you come through the front of the house as spatial segregation, because that's for the white folks who enter that space to have access through this by way of this nice grand stairs. If the enslaved people working in that same space or existing in that same space for whatever reason wants access to the upper level, there's usually a second set of stairs. And those are the things that these interpreters can be talking about. Or you can tell them that if they peel back the layers of what is now this nice architecturally significant house, and you see those axe marks on those logs that used to be trees, that's now the infrastructure of that house that's holding it together. You interpret the fact that those were placed there by enslaved people. You can include that in your narrative. Now, when I go to these spaces and it's only the big house that's standing and I sleep in them because, we belong there too.
You shared that a slave dwelling can come in a variety of sizes and building materials based on the reason in which they were constructed. Knowing this history, how do you prepare for an overnight stay?
14 years ago when I started, a lot of these spaces that I was going to for the first time on the day that I was supposed to spend the night in this unfamiliar space, outside alone in some cases. So at the beginning, I was taking padding, a sleeping bag, and a pillow, and a club in anticipation of maybe an animal, a raccoon or a possum or something trying to nibble at my feet or something of that nature. So I was taking that. Now, initially, when I started this thing 14 years ago, I was only going to stay in the state of South Carolina and do that because that's where my limited resources would take me. And sometimes the invitations that were getting on the calendar, a lot of times the slave dwellings weren't there. Sometimes they were ruins. They're the Tabby ruins on the Fusky Island. So that factored in also. But most of the places that went on to the calendar initially were indeed where slave cabins still existed or reproduced based on archaeology that was done in that space. The cabins at the presidential sites, Jefferson and Madison, they are recreated based on the archaeology that was done there. So the cabins that are usually built for field hands, they're usually duplexes. The chimneys are usually in the middle. And again, it depends on if it's the first generation of cabins or the second generation of cabins that you're talking about. Because on the more established plantations on the east, they sometimes, if cabins still exist, they're the second generation of cabins that were built there at that site, or sometimes maybe even the third, depending on the particular plantations where existed. Most of them, if they were built there for the field hands, they would be duplexes with the chimney in the middle. And that's a telltale sign of these cabins. Now, if the enslaved people were working in or near the big house, as the blacksmith or the cook or the washer woman, they would be living in cabins closer to the big house. These cabins closer to the big house would be more aesthetically pleasing because they're near the big house. So a lot of these cabins, a lot of these dwellings still exist that are near the big house because they're usually built of the same material as the big house. Brick, more sturdy. So there are those spaces also. But the spaces come in various sizes and there are various uses. Some of these uses will upset you, but these spaces exist and they're being used as various things that I've seen in my time, but I'll put a period right there.
Joe, this is fascinating. I can't wait to learn more about your overnight experiences in these dwellings. We'll dive more into your story after we take a moment to appreciate our episode sponsor.
On June 19, Americans will celebrate Juneteenth, a national holiday that commemorates and celebrates the end of slavery in the United States. My colleagues and I at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation invite you to come spend Juneteenth with us. Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth celebration will be spread over 3 days this year, from Sunday, June 16 through Wednesday, June 19. We have lots of great programs and events planned that commemorate emancipation through themes of family, resilience, achievement, and spirituality. Master blacksmith Darrell Reeves and his apprentice Karina Rocca will be giving talks and working in the Colonial Williamsburg blacksmith shop, demonstrating 18th and 19th century traditions of African-American ironwork. Acclaimed storyteller Sheila Arnold will help us embrace the power of hope, resilience, and the unyielding desire for freedom in a couple of different programs, including Permission to be Free, a Juneteenth story. And the world-renowned poet Nikki Giovanni will speak at Colonial Williamsburg's annual Juneteenth sunrise service. Plus, my colleagues throughout our art museums and historic area will offer special tours, performances, and programs. So please, come to Williamsburg and join us. Visit colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth for a complete list of Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth festivities and how you can plan your visit. That's colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth. And if you do come to Williamsburg, let me know you're coming, because the Innovation Studios team and I will be walking around the historic area supporting and enjoying these great programs.
So, Joe, would you share with us what it was like on your first overnight stay?
Oh, the first one. Yeah. In fact, it was 14 years ago, Mother's Day, Magnolia Plantation. Let me tell you about the action before and getting there. So the word was out. It was pretty popular. So therefore, at Magnolia Plantation, the very first night, there was a local TV news camera there to cover it. The host had lit the fire in the fireplace. Although it was May, it wasn't necessary. But, looking back, it was ambient. It was all about the space and the ambient, and it was a good decision. So I'm told a story by the cameraman from the TV station, and he talks about a time in South Africa when he was in a tent about to go to sleep, and he is awakened by a thud on his chest. That thud on his chest is a tarantula. So he tells me this story and he leaves. The other guy who was there, Chris Smith, he is kind of over the wildlife. He knows, he reminds me that there are alligators on this property, and he leaves. So now here I am in this cabin with an oak tree right beside it with a limb that every time the wind blows, it interacts with the roof. And I have to get up about 5 times to verify that that's what I'm hearing. But even before all that is the thoughts that are in your head about actual people who may have been sleeping in these spaces and people like them and what they thought about. Did they think about their stolen labor? Did they think about running away? Did the mothers think about the fact that they are the birth mothers of these children, but the laws of that time said they weren't? They said that they were chattel. So you think about things. Then you eventually go to sleep, if you could turn your mind off after thinking about those things. And I did. I went to sleep and I woke up the next morning, Mother's Day of 2010, and I was not familiar with the property. This was my second time on that property. So, not know where I was going, I took a walk and I ended up in the cemetery. And I saw the headstones that were there because it was an active cemetery up until the 1990s. But the older headstones indicated to me that some of these people were born enslaved but died free because they had a headstone. Now, after those headstones ended and before the tree line started, is a grassy spot. And in that grassy spot, if you know what to look for, and what you look for, the indentations. Because if they were lucky enough to have been buried in a box, that box would eventually give way and the earth above it would conform. So that's one of those telltale signs. And that's why when I knew that I was about to go on this journey to tell their stories, because on this earth they were muted. And now we have an opportunity to tell their stories. And that's what these spaces can do. That's what these slave dwellings can do. We remind people of these things and keep them reminded. So that's what we do.
I'm sure your work has prompted diverse reactions, reflecting the complex nature of discussing slavery and its impacts on American society. Overall, how has your work with the Slave Dwelling Project been received?
They think it's told best by the number of places that invite me back. There's a whole list of those. So in my head, that looks great. But to anyone on the outside looking in, we invite people to invite us in. We can come into your world and show you where those places are, those slave dwellings nearest you. And we can let you know if we have interacted with those places or should be interacting with those places. Because, sometimes we have to remind folks that we are here for them and they can have access to us if they just choose to.
So have there been any challenges or obstacles that have discouraged you from staying at a particular site?
Yeah, we got some no's when I first started pitching the idea to folks very early on in the process. And I cannot fault folks for not wanting to believe a person wanting to come spend the night in your slave dwelling and in the story that he peddling. And I use the word peddling because that's pretty much what it was. But the thing is, I had gotten so many yeses that I didn't worry about that particular no. I just kept moving forward just based on the fact that the yeses were there. And the yeses continued to pile up. And this same entity that gave me my first no called me 2 years later and explained to me why they said no. And their reason was this: just as I consider what I do research, so does Ghost Hunters. So they tell everybody no. I said, okay, that's fair. They said, so you can come and you can stay because you have proven that what you said you would do, you are indeed doing. So if that invitation is open. So I've stayed out there. Again, we are here for those who want to engage with us.
In Sleeping with the Ancestors, you discuss one of the most powerful aspects of your work, connecting with descendants of enslaved people. How have your encounters with descendants impacted your work?
Oh, it has had a great impact, past, present, and future. Very early on into sleeping in slave dwellings, I had an invitation to a conference by a group called Coming to the Table. And I went there, and this group, their goal, one of their goals, is to communicate with and have descendants of both sides, enslavers and those who were enslaved. And sometimes the DNA proves that these can exist in one person. Still, having all these people interact, what they were doing is kind of the human element of what I'm doing. I'm trying to save the physical space. A genealogist told me very early on, she said, Joe, you do what you do. You save the space and we'll put the people there. So I think it's kind of a concert of things that are going on because I've developed good relations also with archaeologists. I love archaeologists because our story has not been documented in the manner that it should have been documented. These archaeologists, these genealogists have the ability to help us tell the story, help us put the meat on the bone of what in some cases is just speculation. But speculation is good too when you're not telling the stories of the enslaved at all. Sometimes you got to interpret or reinterpret the material that you use to tell the stories that you're now telling. You could look at that same letter differently. If that letter says, well, we bought X number of slaves, X number of slaves are being disciplined for whatever reason, somebody ran away. You reference these things in these letters, but those are not the part of those letters that they have access to that they're sharing with their public. Again, they just got to look at this thing differently and interpret these things differently. Some of these places deserve to be recognized when they are.
So have any descendants participated in overnight stays with you?
So the way that I got into Thomas Jefferson's place is descendants of Sally Hemings were there. And the Gillettes, they were also enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. In fact, Thomas Jefferson enslaved 600 people. These were descendants of Sally Hemings. And there was almost a fist fight because there are those of that element, that group, who wants to believe that that was a consensual relationship. And then there's the others who want to believe that it was rape. And that was the issue. And it almost came to blows, and I had to physically get in between them to keep them from going to blows. So, yeah, I've spent nights with descendants of enslavers and those who were enslaved. And a lot of times around the campfire that we're doing a lot of more lately, it is revealed then as people introduce themselves, they will introduce themselves as a descendant of an enslaver. And it's interesting because, in these conversations, you got people who don't look like each other, who don't necessarily agree with each other in whatever subject matter it might be, are there having these conversations at these historic spaces. So now that's a lot of the substance of what we do.
Joe, as we have this conversation, it is clear that history is more than just dates and facts. It's about connecting the lived experiences of those who came before us. Now, by spending the night in these slave dwellings, you provided an immersive experience that allows participants to connect with the past in a deeply personal way. How do you think spending a night in slave dwellings could help other people connect with history?
Historical Commission. One of the team members, a white gentleman, asked if he could spend the night in the space with us. And up until that point, there was just Black folk spending the night in those spaces with me. And I had to make a decision about him to spend the night in the space tonight, shortly after he asked the question. So I didn't have a lot of time. And I said yes, because here's the thing. To have said no is preaching to the choir. That's why I want everybody to have this opportunity. Everybody to be able to engage because everyone has a network. If we have allies and white folks taking and telling the stories of our enslaved ancestors, that's a good thing because they have networks too, whoever they talk to. So I think that's some means of getting the stories out about these spaces and the need to preserve these spaces because the people who preserve these spaces are the ones we need to convince that we need access to these places. We need access to having a conversation with them to convince them to tell the stories, the elements of our enslaved ancestors in a manner that they should tell it. And to that point, another element of what we do at the Slave Dwelling Project is called Inalienable Rights, Living History Through the Eyes of the Enslaved. It's kind of like Colonial Williamsburg on wheels. So we have the ability to go to sites where if we go to these sites, if I go to these sites, amongst the staff, I am probably the only Black person in the photo if we were to do that. A lot of these places that we're getting access to are places who don't have folks who look like me on their staff. So we have the ability to go to these sites and do these living history programs through highlighting the existence of our ancestors, but also their agency. They were still people. They were still human. They were still doing things that real people do. They were making the bricks. We were the blacksmiths. We were the cooks. But in that cooking, there's pride. In everything that we do, there's pride. There's us. We are all there. So we demonstrate these things at these places. So we have the ability to do that also.
So, Joe, are there any specific slave dwellings that you haven't visited yet, but would like to in the future?
Ultimately, the White House, because we built that. And that would be nice. It's on a short list. There are others that I would consider, and I have made it public that I would. Next month, I will be spending a night on the Amistad, the replica thereof, of course, in Mystic Seaport. So I'm looking forward to that. But the short answer to the question is the White House.
So, would you consider conducting overnight stays in any international locations?
Oh, yes, especially during winter that exists here in the United States, because in other places of the world, that's less of a threat. So if we can align those two things, I think that would be great. To be true to the calling, I think connecting that triangle would be necessary because I've only touched one point of it. So now I want to get to those other 2 points of the triangle and see how that goes.
Through firsthand experiences, you've learned a great deal about the daily lives, struggles, and resilience of enslaved people. How has your understanding of history and the legacy of slavery in America evolved through your experiences with the Slave Dwelling Project?
Well, it has helped me control my anger, and that anger, finding out through research that what I was taught was not real history. My hopes in having others not having to go through that, check in the system to remind them of that aspect of history. And I think that walking in that space, you got to walk boldly because, again, you are the voices of the enslaved ancestors. We have to honor them through our actions. And that's what the Slave Dwelling Project is about, being the voices of our enslaved ancestors. And along the way, maybe not, having everyone agree with you, but telling the stories through the documented history, the receipts as they're now known, continuing to tell the stories of our enslaved ancestors. And the Slave Dwelling Project is proud to be a part of that. I think we're governed to do just that.
So, Joe, what do you hope readers will take away from your book, Sleeping with the Ancestors?
The book is that way of allowing readers to, be that reader. But if you think about your history class, sometimes for a lot of people, it was a class that they probably dreaded. But think about this as that history class in the amount of time it takes you to read 85,000 words, or you can listen to it also. So there's that option. But I want to give people that opportunity to see history in that capsulated way through my eyes, to know it should be something that should be remembered and learned from, or used as an opportunity to not to do some of the things we've done in the past, because we've done some bad things. And I think that by reminding people of those things is good, but also through the living historians, reminding people that we were still resilient, we were still human, we still made it through. And we, as folks today, are the results of that. We are the evidence of their existence. We are their hope, and we should speak loudly about them.
Before we move on to the time warp question, Joe, what advice would you give others who want to get involved in preserving African American history and heritage?
Well, you're going to have to live it. You're going to have to breathe it. Kind of like what I did with an idea about sleeping in places. Everybody can sleep, but take that idea and apply it and use that idea to gain access to places that normally one would not. Before I settled on the idea of the slave dwellings, I was thinking about the Green Book, because people who lived the necessity of the Green Book are still alive. And places that Green Book references are still standing. And I was going to use my time to concentrate on that. But there are a lot of people who are doing that, and that's a good thing. That's the beautiful thing. But here's my point. There are elements of our history that if one person takes it and lives it and breathes it, then it could be their sustenance. It could be their job. It could be their advocacy. It could be their thing. But what you are also doing is keeping that subject matter out there. Good example is this. A lot of applications that buildings use to get onto the National Registry of Historic Places, a lot of those applications were done in the 70s or whenever they started doing them. They came in abundance, and they were usually done by white folks. And these white folks came with biases, and it shows in their applications because slave dwellings are usually labeled, if labeled at all, as dependencies or outbuildings, not using that word slavery. So if somebody wants to take that on and research these documents, pull all these documents and see how the language that they use for getting these places on the National Register and insert us into those spaces where we need to be, then I think that's a full-time job or a class assignment. But, there are elements of our history that people can just concentrate on and make it theirs and make it their business, and literally their business. So that's my advice.
Now for the time warp question. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone would have acted differently. You shared the story about visiting the Anne Frank House site in Amsterdam and how pivotal this experience was in your journey to develop the Slave Dwelling Project. In your opinion, do you think your life would be different if you never visited that site?
You have to also take into account that I had a similar experience at the Lorraine Motel, the site of where Dr. King was assassinated. So similar, but different. But being in that space, being in both spaces, brought me to the realization that the preservation of spaces is important to tell a story. I think that situation in Amsterdam, coupled with the experience that I was having being in the Air Force, living a life that included a lot of people who did not look and think like me, and being able to adjust and be a part of that life, I think that was probably the thing, I want to put it that way, that kind of propelled me in the direction of this preservation thing. Another something that happened was when I was at South Carolina State University after doing my 6 years in the Air Force, my sophomore year was approaching, and the National Park Service came through recruiting for summer help. And I applied. The reason I applied was because one of the recruiters was a person who graduated from the same high school I did just a year before. He went straight to college. I went into the Air Force. And he's my cousin. So I went to chat with him at the table. He convinced me to do an application. I did. And of course, I got hired as a park ranger at Fort Sumter. So that kind of set me in a parallel direction to get to the place where I am now. And I did my thing with the Park Service. And then I left the Park Service and I went to Penn Center on St. Helena Island. And that was one of the first schools built during the Civil War for the education of recently enslaved people. They were part of the Court Royal experiment that was to prove that Black folks could indeed live in a society as people. I worked there, and then I left there, and I went to Iowa, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to build an African American museum. So yeah, I was there doing that. That was a fun job. Learned a lot. So I think I've had a good career doing what I do. And, I've had fun doing it. So that's good.
So do you think you would have taken a different route if you never visited some of those sites?
I'm a person, again, I'm not afraid of the unknown. I went on a mission to Afghanistan. When I was working with the National Trust for Historic Preservation and they cut my hours, I was looking for a way to compensate for that, get back that lost income. So I signed up to go on a mission to Afghanistan, and we would ride on these Yugoslavian planes with a Yugoslavian crew, and we would be guards for the military equipment that was being shipped to Afghanistan for the war. See, I'm a person of adventure. Because that was available, I did it, and it was good adventure. And I could be spontaneous too. I'll show up places and I don't mind. That's what the Air Force kind of prepared me for. Be nimble, be able to respond and physically able to move and get there and do what you need to do and get out.
It sounds like you would have been prepared for history preservation work no matter what path you chose.
We cannot ignore the ancestors. Although people try to make me realize more than I do that it is the ancestors that are guiding my step. But, maybe my ego wants to make me believe that it's me. But, we cannot ignore the fact that we are doing this for them. And it's for them that I put them into my decision making of what I do, where I go, and how I represent them when I go to these places. I was in Harpersville, Alabama, about 3, 4 days ago. We had a conversation amongst people who don't look like each other, and it got tense. It got real tense. But those are the kinds of conversations I like. Nobody raised their voices, but things were said, and people were letting off steam, and we all walked away with a better understanding of the other person's side or point of view. So I invite those kinds of conversations. They get a little heated at times. Sometimes people want to, even descendants, people who are related through blood, sometimes want to swing on each other. But having the conversations are good too. We've learned some good things. We've learned some surprising things in some of these conversations, but it's still that opportunity to talk. You usually see people on social media, and because of social media, they comment, and sometimes you can see a nice dialogue going, but then it has a tendency to get ugly. I like that space before it gets ugly. I like that part. I like engaging people. And I think being face to face with people, it has less of a tendency to get ugly. So access to these places gives us that opportunity to bring people together. People don't usually communicate with each other together, and having these conversations and walking away with these conversations with a better understanding of that other person. So
Now, I've taken a look at your upcoming calendar on your website, and you are already booked for most of 2024. This is awesome, Joe. This is great. With that being said, what's next for you and the Slave Dwelling Project?
In Philadelphia, October 3rd through the 5th, The Illusion of Freedom, Slavery in Northern States is the title. So that's occupying most of my time, getting that in order. And then we're taking dates to go on the calendar for 2025. But 2026, we are always thinking about 2026 because that's the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. I remind people that even today is the 250th anniversary of something. And my point is, we want to remind folks that they don't have to wait until that date of whatever in 2026. We need to start now. We need to start ensuring that the voices of all are represented in these opportunities to do whatever can be done at these historic sites. So we're willing to come to your sites. We're willing to be the voices of enslaved people of that period. So we're having our living historians concentrate more on that period in history. For some, it's easy because they're already doing it. But for some of the living historians, it might be something new for them. So we want to, as the Slave Dwelling Project, let these sites know that if they want to bring one of the living historians to their sites, they could just check and see what person would be more appropriate for what you want them to do. And we can make it happen. So again, don't wait until 2026 to do this.
Thank you for sharing that information, Joe. So where is the best place to look for more information about you and the Slave Dwelling Project?
Most active on Facebook, but on Facebook, you should go to the Slave Dwelling Project page.
Thank you so much, Joe. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. And we look forward to learning more about the Slave Dwelling Project as you continue in the future.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I think it was a beautiful interview. This was fun. I loved it.
Throughout our discussion, Joe shared his unwavering dedication to shedding light on the living conditions and experiences of enslaved people by highlighting the physical spaces they inhabited, spaces that are often overlooked in American history. These spaces, varying widely from Southern plantation cabins to brick buildings in Northern states, are crucial in understanding the full scope of slavery's impact. Joe's work underscores the importance of preserving these sites to ensure the history of slavery is represented with authenticity and depth. One of the most key aspects of Joe's work with the Slave Dwelling Project is his emphasis on the human element, the thoughts, emotions, and stories that are evoked by being in spaces where enslaved people once lived. He passionately argues for the importance of telling these stories through immersive experiences and living history programs, which highlight the agency of humanity of enslaved people. By engaging diverse participants, including allies from various backgrounds, Joe aims to foster great understanding and empathy. And despite the challenges he often faces in gaining access to these sites, he remains committed to his mission. Joe tirelessly works with the site stewards to ensure accurate and inclusive storytelling, emphasizing the need for collaboration in these preservation efforts. His interactions with descendants of enslaved people are particularly impactful, adding a profound human connection to his work. These conversations, even when marked by disagreements, are vital in promoting historical accuracy and reconciliation. As we look towards the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution in 2026, Joe points to the urgency of starting initiatives now to ensure the voices of all people are represented in historical preservation efforts. Through his book, Sleeping with the Ancestors, and his advocacy for immersion and ownership in historical research, Joe McGill inspires us to view history through the lens of inclusivity and resilience. He reminds us that by learning from the past, we can build a more informed and compassionate future.
Thank you, Ashley. I really enjoyed learning about the Slave Dwelling Project and the different ways slave dwellings reveal more about the lives and work of enslaved people. As Joe and Ashley mentioned, slave dwellings are places where we can investigate how enslaved people lived, how they raised families, and more about their intimate or personal lives. We talk often on this podcast about how the historical record lacks records from Black and Indigenous peoples, but as Joe and Ashley showed us, we should take seriously how slave dwellings, the physical spaces in which enslaved people lived and worked, can offer us important sources and historical records about enslaved people. And that's fascinating to me. Okay, look for more information about Joe, his book, Sleeping with the Ancestors, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/386. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so please tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other interesting stories of historic preservation would you like to investigate and explore? Let us know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.